Okay, hi everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Lex again. I'm a transportation reporter at the Toronto Star. Very happy to be here and looking forward to speaking more with all of you. Um, I'm very new to this role, so I thought I would just give a bit of an overview, I guess, about what I do and some things that I've written about, and hopefully you guys will give me a lot more great ideas that I can write about kind of moving forward. So yeah, just to start out, I started the Star just a couple of years ago. Basically March 2020, always a nice time to start a new job. I was for the first couple of years up bright and early, writing the Star's morning newsletter, and then we kind of moved into reporting for the politics team, covering over the course of our federal election and then provincial election, helping out with that. And then I just took over this beat in August, so very fresh. Before that, I was studying at U of T. I did a Master of Global Affairs, focusing on migration and drug policies specifically, but all sorts of things. I'm from Toronto. I've lived here for most of my life. I went to McGill, so I lived in Montreal for a bit. I've also had the pleasure of working and living in London for a bit. And then I noticed someone brought up in the chat, but I spent a semester studying in New Zealand, which was great. Very different transportation over there. It's basically like one-lane highways, but it was a real highlight. And I thought I'd mention, I guess, how I get around, because that's the topic of tonight. So usually walk and cycle around the city, use public transit as well, and drive very occasionally when usually my parents will loan me their car. Yeah, so just a bit more about what I do. I feel like I'm kind of at the point in this new role where I know just enough to realize how little I know. So I'll preface it with that. But I mean, transportation is such an exciting area, and I think really cool to be able to cover something that touches so many people and that's always changing, and that there's really like endless things to write about. But essentially, I write about how people get around the city. Sometimes how people get around the province and the country, but really focusing on the GTA. So that can be anything from writing about public transit, including the TTC and Metrolinx and what goes on within those organizations, infrastructure, so from all that fun stuff, roads, and then safety on our streets. So also for all types of road users, innovation, and then the politics of it all, because obviously it is very political. So it touches everyone, which is great. I feel like when I took over this role, I was excited, but a little bit unsure. Like when you first hear about it, it's not the sexiest thing. But then immediately someone would be like, oh, you cover transportation? Oh, well, will you please write about this? Like no matter who I asked in my life, it felt like they had something that they really needed to talk about right now. And so that's what can be so great about it. It doesn't matter how you get around, how rich or poor you are, what part of the city you live in. I mean, everyone gets around one way or another, and there's lots to talk about. But, you know, I think on the other hand, it's quite a balancing act. I feel like there's no shortage of kind of drivers and cyclists and pedestrians all screaming at each other all the time. And it's so important, I think, in this role for me to like also get out of my own zone of familiarity and how I move around, to try to hear what everyone else is talking about too, and to reconcile, I guess, like the huge differences we have in all the types of people who live in the city and different neighborhoods they live in and things like that. So I thought I would just talk about like a few of the types of things I've written about. So as you can see, it's quite a range. You know, labor issues within big transit organizations, traffic, the infrastructure around the King Street transit corridor. I thought I would just like go a bit more in depth on the story I did on Vision Zero and the traffic story, because those both used a bit of data and were kind of longer ones that I've written about. So I'm sure many of you know, but for those who might not, Vision Zero is essentially a strategy for zero traffic related injuries or deaths. It's a global campaign, but it's been taken up by Toronto and lots of other cities in Europe and North America. So basically the premise behind it is that mistakes are inevitable, but with good transportation policy, they don't have to be fatal. So Toronto's plan was first introduced in 2017, and then it was kind of given a revamp in 2019 because the first iteration wasn't making enough progress. So some things the city has implemented as part of this are reducing speed limits, redesigning roads to make more space for pedestrians and cyclists, having more mid-block crossings, more sidewalks, speed enforcement. I don't know if some of you have noticed those like pedestrian head start signals now that the light turns green for walkers before it does for drivers. That's one major thing actually that I've really noticed. So is it working? I mean, data, I feel like with COVID, data is weird. So it looks like it is in some ways, but I think we also have to take into account that 2020 was a weird year where there weren't a lot of people on the roads. There especially weren't as many drivers on the roads. So if we kind of treat that as a bit of an anomaly, I think in terms of fatalities, we haven't seen tons of progress. We'll see how it is for the last 2 months of the year. For injuries, we have definitely seen some progress, but I think overall, if the strategy is zero injuries or deaths, we still have kind of a long way to go. So the story kind of focused on how we're doing and then some ideas for how to fix it, speaking with people who are smarter than myself in these areas. So I think the crux is fewer cars and more space is how we'll get to safer roads. Funding is of course an issue here. I think a lot of people feel like this isn't one of the city's main priorities. Toronto spent kind of just over 200 million on this. And if you compare that, I mean, one advocate I spoke to compared that to the Gardner rebuild, which is going to be about 2 billion. So obviously there is a disparity there. But I think the crux of it is really making other modes of travel safer and more desirable, because it is drivers in cars that tend to cause these kinds of accidents. And then of course, things do take time to, in making these changes on our roads does not happen overnight. So maybe we'll see more progress moving forward. So that is kind of the crux of that story. And then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end or ideas or criticism or anything like that. And then this is the other story I would just want to talk about briefly, which essentially was where my boss asked me to get stuck in traffic because he was complaining about how bad traffic was. And I, as I mentioned, don't drive that often, so I hadn't really had the pleasure of experiencing the pain firsthand. So he asked me to do that, and so I went out on a Wednesday in the morning during rush hour and just kind of drove around downtown, and then I went out again in the evening, and can confirm it was bad. Obviously it's a bit different when you're like looking for the traffic, because then I was like kind of excited because it added to my story. I was like, I can barely get across this intersection 5 lights later, and I was like, perfect. But yeah, I mean, I think that we've had a lot of changes, of course, that are impacting congestion right now. We've kind of seen like a big return to events like concerts and other things downtown. People are kind of going back to work. I think traffic is bad. We also aren't used to it. But one thing I did find, which is interesting, and this is kind of a slight data challenge I came across, because the city does have good data on congestion and on like car volume, but the locations they gave weren't exactly apples to apples. So I'll show on the next slide here. Maybe I'll just go quickly, because like if you see here, car volume, this is the week I did the article, so that week in September was 80% downtown of what it was pre-COVID. But then if you look at like morning rush hour congestion, people were essentially waiting as long as they were compared to the baseline the year before COVID. And so that struck me, because I was like, well, less cars but people are waiting about the amount that they were before. Obviously, as I mentioned, that wasn't like apples to apples data. So take from that what you will. I mean, I think the reality is congestion is bad, so why? Construction, I think, is a pretty obvious one. It feels like driving around or walking around or biking around, it's really obvious. Just a lot of streets are torn up, kind of redoing streetcar tracks, just lots of work that was maybe put off during COVID, which means that like a lot of routes are diverted. I noticed this also just like on my normal streetcar route on College now has kind of been changed. And then I think lagging transit ridership is also still a part of it. I think our weekday TTC ridership is like now like 65-70%, which is still pretty low. And when you consider how many people the TTC carries every day compared to how many people roads can carry, it's like a huge disparity. And so that makes a big difference, clogging up downtown. And so this is definitely an ongoing focus for me. I think moving forward, this is something that I'll probably continue to write about, is just like how our city is changing in that way. And I think a big reason why I wrote this article too is that we have a lot of changes coming for the city. I mean, as we know, we're building a massive subway line, which will ultimately be really important for getting around the city. But in the meantime, while it's being built, I think it will be really disruptive. And so that was kind of the idea behind the headline of like, yeah, it's really bad and it's kind of only going to get worse. So that concludes the end of my little spiel. Here's the data again if you want to take a look. But I just want to take the opportunity to say that, again, as I said, I'm new to this. There's so much that I want to and should be covering. So please, if you have any ideas for me, I'd love to talk about traffic or road safety or really any of the other aspects of transportation that exist out there. And also, if anyone has good ideas for like uses of data, to be honest, it's not something that I've worked with a ton. And it's so important, I think, in this area too. So I'd be glad to take any suggestions and looking forward to meeting you all and chatting with you later. But in the meantime, if anyone has questions.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.